I'd like to share with you this morning a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, the first African-American woman named Poet Laureate of the United States. And the poem is dedicated and called Paul Robeson. That time, we all heard it, cool and clear, cutting across the hot grit of the day. The major voice, the adult voice, foregoing rolling river, foregoing tearful tale of bale and barge and other symptoms of an old despond. Warning in music words devout and large that we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Paul Robeson, as I'm sure all of you know, was a giant in our history. World-class athlete, Phi Beta Kappa, only Black student at Rutgers when he was there, spoke multiple languages, had a voice, you have to hear it to believe it. Were known around the world for his acting and his beautiful singing, and during the Depression and throughout his life, he was someone, and this is what Brooks is pointing out, he was someone who spoke the truth. He spoke about the plight of the working man and woman. He spoke about the grinding effects of, unfortunately, the downsides of our system of capitalism and the grinding effects, especially on people of color. At one time, he traveled to the Soviet Union. He definitely cherished socialist ideals, and he said when he was there, "Here, I finally feel like a man. Here I walk in full human dignity." Now, when he refused to take back his words and his critique of what is happening in his country and ours, our government arranged to have him blacklisted and revoked his passport, which essentially, for a fair period of time, cratered his career. He was erased, like so many other human beings, and so many other stories have been erased. But during the Depression, he was vocal and active. He went to strikes that were organized. He participated in as many events as he could. So I want to tell a story of two different Depression experiences that happened at the same time. Maybe some of you, how many of you read John Steinbeck's towering novel, The Grapes of Wrath? Yeah. High school English, right? And it's a powerful and beautiful novel, a story of what has been called the Dust Bowl migration. Maybe you saw the movie that John Ford made the year after the novel came out. Maybe you've seen the poignant and powerful photographs of photographer Dorothea Lange. And all of these images and these words tell of a story of what was indeed a very difficult migration. Roughly 325,000 people from southwestern states and midwestern states, who only about 6% of them were actually in the Dust Bowl, but still the financial and economic conditions destroyed many businesses and many lives. And so they came to California, many of them with their mattresses on their carts and their belongings, and they came to California looking for work. Some of them indeed had to spend much time in makeshift camps. But many of them, 1 in 6 of them were white-collar workers. The majority of them were white. Although there was a small proportion of African Americans. But many of them did find jobs, and many of them stepped into jobs vacated by Mexicans who had been, quote unquote, repatriated, forced to go back to Mexico. And many of them walked into land that Mexicans had to abandon. I do not for a moment diminish anybody's experience, much less the experience of these individuals who had to leave their homes to take care of their families. It is every bit as difficult to process as any other experience. I do want to say, though, that those images that we have as that being kind of the narrative of the Great Depression is, at best, not complete, and at worst, inaccurate. In that narrative, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he came into power in 1933, solved the problems of the Depression when he and his administration inaugurated the New Deal. Thanks to the research of Dr. Frank, who I mentioned earlier in the service, we, at least I, know more, fuller details that can help us understand how that came about. So at the time that the Dust Bowl migrants were making their way across their country to find a better life, roughly 1 million Mexicans were forcibly pressured into being repatriated and going back to Mexico. Tens of thousands of others were actually, again, forcibly by fairly aggressive immigration authorities, were actually deported. Authorities in California and other southwestern states searched for Mexicans in mental hospitals and institutions and put them on trains to Mexico. The caravans were so long that getting to the border, often folks had to wait for days. There are stories in the newspapers at the time, especially in Spanish language newspapers, of individuals who had considered asking or applying for United States citizenship. You couldn't have dual citizenship at that time. And they decided, one man said, "Nunca voy a pisar mi bandera. I'm never going to step on my flag. Viva Mexico." So he didn't apply. There was pride along with the pain of going through this process. In a small settlement, relatively speaking, where there were maybe less than 200 families, Mexican families, who lived in a higher level of poverty than most. They didn't have cars or trucks to get to, or any way to get to the border, so they decided they would walk with whatever they could carry, with to the 150 miles to Laredo in order to comply with this directive. And when Mexican communities in the region heard what was happening, they did what we've talked about already this morning. They showed up. They showed up with cars. They showed up with trucks. They showed up with household goods. They showed up with food and supplies for babies. Actually, a couple of babies were born during this part of the caravan. And so these folks did not have to walk, and they arrived with enough to begin their life again. I'll just, as a quick note, will say that we know the history that in Europe during the 1930s and late 1920s, racist and xenophobic sentiments were growing. The blaming of different marginalized communities was happening more and more in the United States. A 1924 immigration law severely curtailed immigration. Mexicans were only allowed to come for harvest times, and then they had to go back. Now, I'm only singling out this one story. There are many. This is the dark side of history, and there's always a dark side, and that's often what we try to forget or erase. The light and the inspiration for me comes from the basic decency of most of us. So So not just Mexicans, Greeks, Italians, Jews, indigenous peoples, Black people, communities, white people, communities around the country rose up in these, as we heard, mutual aid societies and labor and consumer societies. A group of unhoused men and unemployed men in Seattle ended up creating a cooperative that served thousands of people. They fed them, although if you had a job, you weren't allowed to live in there, in the living places that they created. The Junior Black League of Harlem, also a mutual aid and labor and consumer exchange, ended up having roughly 140 different offices around the country and served 100,000 people. These mutual aid societies made so much of a difference. Most of them also not just served and saved one another in their communities, they did what they could to persuade the government to make changes, to improve labor conditions and salaries, and just generally improve the lot of working people in this country. Mexican labor organizers organized a strike. Actually, it was 140 strikes, but they all went out off the job. It was a farm workers' strike on the same day, and actually negotiated, not much, but slightly higher salaries in that time. And as these organizations advocated, they did the work of charity and they did the work of advocating, and they did put pressure on the government. And when the New Deal was enacted, I'm not saying it wasn't a major achievement, but it's clear that it was propelled and encouraged by the work of our ancestors. Many of you have mentioned your ancestors in this country during that time. The hard work that was done at the grassroots to, as someone said this morning, to make a better world for all of us. And so on this almost Labor Day of 2025, let me share what I think might be some important lessons for us to take. Because Dr. Frank wrote this book, which was just published. She wrote this book because she wanted us to not just remember, but reclaim this history of hope. Yes, it is a history of suffering, but it's also a history of hope and determination and resilience. So here are the lessons I hope we can draw this morning. When we reclaim these largely untold stories, we learn from them. And when we learn from them, we do better. When we don't learn, when we don't know that they happened, we have no way of learning. And so we keep, as a society, we keep making the same mistakes. We keep blaming immigrants, or we keep, blaming other communities for our troubles. And, the Depression was blamed on Mexicans, it was blamed on Filipinos, on Puerto Ricans, on all these different groups, which sounds familiar, doesn't it? At one point in early 1931, immigration authorities did what they're doing today. They went into a little park in Los Angeles called La Placita, and they rounded up 400 people right there with guns and the whole bit. And a number of them were deported, and all of them were taken into detention. We make the same mistakes when we don't learn. The second lesson I think we can learn is that while charity is life-saving and life-giving, activism, solidarity, and advocacy changes systems. We need both. We need to change the conditions under which people live if we can, by what we give, but we need to change the systems so that all of us can live better. The third lesson is that we can know, you and I today, as we sit here or listen to the sound of my voice, we can learn that we've been here before and we made a difference. And we can make a difference now. And we are making a difference now. And that's good to remember and good to center us in our faith in particular. And for Unitarian Universalists, folks, when the Depression hit, we lost many congregations. The two denominations hadn't joined yet. That didn't happen until 1961. But churches closed. Nobody could pay a minister. Nobody could keep the buildings open. We lost a tremendous number of people. And as the Depression went on, our churches, we rolled up our sleeves and we did the work that needed to be done to help, just like everyone else, to help others in our communities all around the country. And what happened? Our churches filled up again. People wanted to be part of a movement to make things better. So I point that out now because as we have seen, we are yearning, so many of us are yearning for a community that will hold us and see us, and a community that will give us an opportunity to help others and make our efforts count. Beloveds, I know this has been a message of, in some levels, despair, but I hope what you hear is the message of hope. We can remember, we can process, we can learn, and we do help. Amen. Ashe, and blessed be. So I invite you to rise in body or spirit, and let's sing together hymn number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song. You may be seated. Dear ones, I send you with blessing. Well, I send you with many blessings today. Each of you carry, as I do, as we all do, each of us carries the light of ancient stardust. Each of us carries within us the spirit of light and hope and compassion. I am so very grateful to be with you and grateful that we can be together. And just remember, love wins. And if love hasn't won, it isn't over. Go in peace. Enjoy the postlude.